June 16, 1943. A freight yard 2 miles inland from Peenemünde, on Germany's Baltic coast. The air tasted of salt and burnt oil, and a low wind pushed the metallic tang of machine grease through the empty sidings. Lanterns guttered behind stacks of timber. The silhouette of a long, angular building, Test Shed 1, loomed like a sleeping beast under a sky that promised rain. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the sea was a black mouth, and in the stillness the rhythm of distant machinery sounded like a heartbeat. Hissing hydraulics, the hollow thunk of testing stands settling after another run. On the far side of the compound, men in overcoats moved like shadows between cargo crates, stamped with cryptic Luftwaffe seals. He moved with them, and not with them. A slight man in a worker's jacket, hands reddened by cold and grease, he kept his face down and his shoulders hunched against the wind. He wore no uniform, just the practical look of a railway fitter. But there was nothing ordinary about the way his eyes catalogued the crates, the security patrols, the routes the guards took between the lamps. He was not a fitter, but a courier for the Armia Krajowa, the Polish underground. In his satchel, hidden beneath a false bottom of smeared newspapers and bread crusts, lay the thing Britain's intelligence officers would later call unbelievable. Detailed engineering sketches and test notes describing a long, slender weapon, its guidance gyros, its liquid fuel chambers, its warhead configurations, and instructions for launching it from a mobile cradle. Hours earlier, inside a maintenance shed, a German lathe operator had left for dinner. The turn of a wrench, the accidental slide of a drawing into the shadow of another crate, that's how the courier had found the pages, loose, annotated, and so precise they read less like rumor and more like instruction. Someone in the test program had been sloppy or simply exhausted. In the brittle autumn of secrecy, the wrong door had been left ajar. He had no time for pride. He folded the pages with the practiced fingers of a man who had learned to hide forbidden things in plain sight, and stepped into the rain. The walk to the siding was a litany of small dangers, the snap of a twig that might draw a guard's flashlight, the metallic clank of a boot on iron that might make a dog raise his head, the distant bark of a watchman who would pass by and never look. At the platform, blunted freight cars waited, their doors sealed and their contents unknown. The courier pressed his palm to the steam-warmed metal and felt the vibration of a boiler still alive inside. Machines talk, he thought. He slid his satchel beneath a pile of canvas and climbed into the darkness, where the sketches would be less likely to be noticed among sacks of coal and spools of cable. The train's whistle blew, and the world began to move. Inside the carriage was another man, a stoker in civilian clothes, who'd been paid to look the other way. They did not speak more than a few phrases, code, dates, a place to pass the parcel, because conversation is an easy thing to recall under interrogation, and silence hides 1,000 coincidences. The courier breathed shallowly, feeling the paper against his thigh. Each bump in the track was a small avalanche of terror. Outside, the countryside flowed past in black stripes, the occasional farmhouse a halo of safety. He thought of Warsaw, the cell he served, and of the parcel's final destination, London, where men in bowler hats and dark suits negotiated the fate of nations. He thought, too, of the faces of the men who had drawn these pages, not evil caricatures, but engineers with steady hands, obliged to the war and proud of a machine that promised to change the angle of fear. At the first safe stop, the courier passed the documents forward to a woman courier, riding in the next carriage. She was an unremarkable figure, a seamstress by trade, with thread in her pocket and a small child's doll in the bag beside her. Under the lining of the doll's torso, the blueprints were folded again, then smeared with candle wax to make them less obvious to casual inspection. She laughed with other passengers, smoked furtive cigarettes, and smoked the smell of danger out of her clothing as if it were nothing. This was how the underground moved. Banal objects, ordinary gestures, and a chain of trust slender as a filament. They changed trains at a station in Berlin, where the posters on the walls proclaimed war victories, and the ticket clerks looked bored with their own certainty. From there, the documents would travel in stages: safe houses, sympathetic clerks, bribes to the right hands, until a single cautious rat line would deposit them into the hands of a Polish exile who had a direct line to London via Lisbon and then neutral Switzerland. The network was a tapestry of redundancy. If one thread broke, another would bear the strain. It was, the courier knew, the very opposite of the neat channels the Reich liked to imagine existed in its machine. When the sketches reached London, weeks later, each transfer a narrow triumph, the reaction was not thunder in action. Instead, the papers were read, noted, and filed. In the smoky rooms of the British Air Ministry, a junior analyst frowned at the gyroscopic diagrams and murmured, "Rocket engines, liquid fuel, possible, but exaggerated." A senior desk officer tossed the pages across the table with the sort of phrase that closes debates: propaganda or some eccentric new shell. Noted, but not urgent. The sketches were marked, initialed, and entered into a long list of reports that already included fanciful claims and enemy deception. Men in authoritative chairs found it easier to disbelieve what seemed to violate the scale of modern warfare: a self-propelled missile that would climb, fall, and strike without an aircraft as delivery system. Back in London, the courier's hands were clean. The paper was in a safe. But the smell of grease and Baltic salt clung to his jacket. He would later remember the exact weight of the satchel, the tremor in his fingers as the train lurched, and the moment the last set of seals clicked into place. He could not know then that those small sketches, dismissed as speculative and wild, were the thin paper skeleton of a weapon that would in less than a year fall like a silent meteor on the roofs of London. For now, in the dim light of a foreign safe house, the men who had to decide whether to act read and conferred, and a consensus of disbelief slid across the official table like a shadow, muting the urgency of a warning that smelled of machine oil and danger.
September 1943. London, England, Air Ministry, Room 47. The ceiling fan hummed quietly over a long oak table, stirring cigarette smoke into thin, lazy spirals. Maps of Europe and aerial reconnaissance photos lined the walls, each one speckled with pins and scribbled annotations. Around the table sat men in uniform and men in tweed, RAF officers, analysts, scientists, all drawn together by a single question that refused to die. Was Germany building a rocket? The papers that had arrived from the Polish underground weeks earlier were spread before them, now slightly creased, the candle wax edges still faintly visible. The line drawings were neat and technical: fuel pumps, stabilizers, combustion chambers, far too detailed for propaganda. But for the men in this room, that was precisely the problem. "Liquid-fueled propulsion," muttered Group Captain Hensley, flicking ash into an overflowing tray. "Fanciful stuff, more like Jules Verne than Hitler." A younger scientist, one of the few who had studied experimental rocketry before the war, leaned forward. "It's not fantasy," he said. "The Germans have engineers at Peenemünde working on advanced propulsion. These sketches mention liquid oxygen. It's theoretically possible." Hensley scoffed. Possible? Yes. Practical? No. Not in wartime, and certainly not at that scale. At the head of the table, Colonel Reginald Frost, liaison to MI6, rubbed his temples. He had seen 1,000 reports like this: rumors of death rays, supercannons, invisible bombers. 99 turned out to be fabrications or wishful thinking. "File it," he said finally. "Mark it for further observation." And with that, the warning, the one smuggled across occupied Europe at mortal risk, was dismissed with a rubber stamp and bureaucratic indifference. While London debated paper, Peenemünde pulsed with fire. On the north coast of Germany, the Army Research Center was a city of secrecy. Behind high fences and floodlights, teams of scientists under von Braun and Dornberger were turning theory into terror. The weapon the Allies refused to believe in already had a name: Vergeltungswaffe 2, the Vengeance Weapon 2. In vast hangars, the first prototypes took shape, 46 feet tall, sleek, silver gray, and lethal. Engineers worked by floodlight and torch, assembling turbines and guidance fins. When tested, the roar of the engines shook the dunes and sent gulls shrieking into the sky. Even hardened Wehrmacht officers flinched at the thunderclap of ignition. The first launch was chaos. The rocket lifted, tilted, and shattered in a cloud of vapor. But with each failure came refinement. They adjusted fuel mix ratios, recalibrated gyros, and reinforced the thin aluminum skin. By October 1942, a prototype streaked 30 miles high before plunging into the Baltic Sea at supersonic speed. It worked. Von Braun watched through binoculars, grinning despite the cold wind off the water. "Gentlemen," he said, "the spaceship has begun." But for all the triumph of science, there was the shadow of something darker. The V-2 wasn't being built to explore. It was built to annihilate. It carried a 120 warhead, its trajectory too fast for interception, its sound arriving after the explosion. To the Germans, it was the ultimate terror weapon, a strike that couldn't be stopped, a psychological blow to crush morale. Still, Peenemünde had eyes watching it. The Polish resistance had been right. Spies from Denmark and Norway began reporting unusual flights, strange contrails over the Baltic, and the appearance of new, heavily guarded compounds. Manalists squinted at the images under magnifying lamps. Some whispered that perhaps those Polish sketches hadn't been exaggeration after all. But by then, the Germans were ready to move their testing further inland, beyond the reach of bombers. The British would get their confirmation, but it would come not from spy reports or photographs, but from the sound of something that moved faster than sound itself. 1 year later, the first V-2 would scream through the stratosphere, unseen, unstoppable, and strike London with the force of a falling comet. The warning had been delivered. It had simply arrived before the world was ready to believe it.
When the sky fell silent. September 8, 1944, Chiswick, London. At 6:43 p.m., a flash of orange split the evening sky. No sirens wailed, no engines droned overhead. Just a strange whistling pressure that lasted less than a second, and then an explosion. The ground convulsed. Houses along Staveley Road folded in on themselves, as if struck by the hand of God. A bus was thrown on its side. Glass rained down in a glittering storm. The blast left a crater 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep. Civilians stumbled into the street, dazed, faces smeared with plaster and soot. The first onlookers thought it had been a gas explosion. There had been no warning, no bomber sound, no aircraft shadow. But among the debris, a British ordnance officer knelt beside a twisted chunk of metal, smooth, tubular, and curved in a way that no conventional bomb casing was. His stomach turned cold. "Sir," he whispered into his radio, "this one, it fell from nowhere." It was the first V-2 rocket to hit London. Hours later, in the War Office map room, officers gathered around a new red pin pushed into a map of London's western suburbs. Colonel Frost, the same man who had once stamped the Polish sketches "not urgent," stood silently as reports came in. There had been similar explosions in Belgium and France. No aircraft seen, no flak fired, no warning. An RAF analyst, pale and trembling, traced a line from the continent to the city. "It's ballistic. It comes from high altitude, maybe from Holland." "Impossible," Frost muttered. "No bomb can do that." The analyst placed the crumpled remains of a rocket fin on the table. "This one did." The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion.
It took only days for the attacks to multiply. Each rocket fell faster than sound. One moment calm, the next annihilation. The Londoners learned a new kind of fear. Instant death without warning. The old air raid sirens were useless. No one could hide, no one could fight back. By November, hundreds were dead. Entire streets vanished overnight. The government censored early reports to prevent panic, calling the blasts gas main explosions. But the people knew. The sound, or rather the absence of sound, became infamous. Londoners whispered about ghost bombs, weapons that fell out of the heavens and left nothing but silence and smoke. In Whitehall, the intelligence officers who had once mocked the Polish courier's documents now studied them line by line, realizing the horrifying accuracy of every measurement. The diagrams they had filed away now described the weapon that was killing their citizens. One of the analysts from that original meeting, the young scientist who had warned them, returned to the table with haunted eyes. He said, "We had this. We had this a year ago." Colonel Frost didn't respond. He just stared at the map, now riddled with red pins. He thought of the courier, the invisible chain of risk that had brought those blueprints across Europe. Men and women who had died, believing Britain would act on what they carried. He had no words left to give them. Across the channel, at a launch site hidden in a pine forest near The Hague, Major General Dornberger watched as another V-2 rocket was raised into firing position. The countdown echoed across the concrete pad. At ignition, the flame erupted, bright enough to blind. The rocket climbed on a pillar of fire, its roar rolling like thunder. Technicians shielded their faces. Within minutes, it was gone. 200 miles in 10 minutes. Unstoppable, untouchable. Inside the command bunker, a German officer smiled. "London will learn obedience," he said. Von Braun, standing behind him, said nothing. He knew this wasn't victory. It was vengeance. The V-2 was supposed to change the war. Instead, it became the sound of desperation. Each launch drained Germany's dwindling fuel reserves and manpower. Each explosion only hardened British resolve. But in the streets of London, that truth was cold comfort. To the civilians picking through rubble, it didn't matter that the rocket was strategically useless. It was death from the sky, invisible, mechanical, and merciless. And in a locked filing cabinet in the Air Ministry, the original Polish sketches still lay in their folder, smudged, yellowed, and marked with a single word in fading ink: speculative.
The Spy Who Was Right All Along. February 1945, Warsaw, in ruins. The city was nothing but bone and ash. Walls leaned without roofs. Streets were black with frost and soot. Somewhere beneath the rubble, in a basement that still smelled faintly of oil and ink, a radio operator tapped out the final transmission of the Polish underground's wartime intelligence network. His code was thin and tired, not the urgent language of resistance anymore, but the weary rhythm of closure. London had finally confirmed it. The V-2 rockets were real. The message reached what was left of his cell, the same network that had smuggled those drawings 2 years earlier from Peenemünde to Lisbon. The couriers who'd carried them were gone, shot, deported, vanished. But among the few who survived, there was no gloating, just the hollow vindication of men who had been right too soon. The story of that chain, from engineer to courier to London desk, would take years to surface. When the war ended, the Allies captured Peenemünde, its launch pad still scarred by Allied bombing. They found pieces of V-2s, crates of blueprints, and files labeled Vergeltungswaffe 2. Many of the scientists had already fled west, seeking capture by the Americans rather than the Soviets. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the brilliant and unrepentant engineer whose design had rained terror on London. The British officers walking through those hangars felt something between awe and shame. The machines were magnificent, sleek, engineered with terrifying precision. And the blueprints, the same lines and annotations they'd once called exaggerated. Same dimensions, same propulsion, same payload. In London, Colonel Frost read the captured documents with a sick weight in his chest. He'd survived the Blitz, the V-1 buzz bombs, and the V-2 barrages. He'd seen London burn twice, once from the air, once from silence. Now he saw the cost of disbelief laid bare in steel and equations. A quiet order went out to the archives. The original Polish documents were to be reclassified, verified intelligence. But no one wrote a memo about the people who had risked everything to deliver them. In the months that followed, the Allies turned the remains of Germany's rocket program into spoils. Operation Paperclip swept up the engineers and their blueprints, scattering them across American and Soviet laboratories. The weapon that had once been designed to flatten cities would, within a decade, launch satellites into orbit and men into space. The nightmare had become the blueprint for a new age. But for the ones who had seen it first, the spies, couriers, and underground messengers, the memory was more personal. One survivor of the Polish resistance, when interviewed years later, recalled that his comrade had described the rocket sketches with trembling awe. It looked like a spear to pierce heaven itself. He paused, before adding softly, "We thought they would listen." March 1945. London. The war was turning. The RAF ruled the skies. The Red Army was closing in on Berlin. Yet every few nights, another V-2 struck the city. One last roar from a dying empire. Each explosion tore open the past, reminding the survivors of the message they had ignored. One evening, Frost walked through Chiswick, the site of the first rocket strike. Children played in the rubble, their laughter echoing off the crater's edge. Someone had planted flowers there, wild daisies that had forced their way through the cracked concrete. He knelt beside them and whispered, "You warned us." It wasn't an apology anyone could hear, but it was all he had. When peace finally came, and the silence after 6 years of thunder settled over Europe, the story of the ignored spy report became one of many lessons written in regret. The documents that once seemed unbelievable were right in every line. The world had learned that disbelief is its own kind of blindness, that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one built in secret, but the truth we choose not to believe. And somewhere in a nameless Polish grave, beneath the ruins of a vanished city, lay the man who had first carried those sketches under his coat, through the rain and the freight yards, believing they might save lives. They could have, if only someone had listened.